Before the UFC had modern weight classes, standard gloves, or anything close to today's rulebook, Don Frye walked into the octagon looking like he had been built in a 1990s action movie. The mustache. The mullet. The 1,000-yard stare. The way he stood there like the whole sport owed him a fight. They called him the Predator, and in early UFC that name did not feel like marketing. It felt like a warning. Because Frye was not just another big personality from the Chaos era. He was one of the first fighters who looked like he understood where the sport was going. He could wrestle. He could punch. He could survive bad positions. He could keep working after the first plan broke. And in a tournament format where you might have to fight 3 men in one night, that mix was terrifying. Most old UFC stories get reduced to one clip. With Frye, it is usually the 8-second knockout. One punch, Thomas Ramirez on the floor, crowd losing its mind. But if that is the only moment you know, you miss the real story. The knockout was not the legend. It was the door opening. The legend is what happened after. Don Frye was born in Sierra Vista, Arizona, and came into fighting with a real athletic base. He wrestled at Arizona State and Oklahoma State. That matters because early UFC was full of men who were dangerous in one lane. A striker could be brutal until he got taken down. A grappler could be brilliant until he got hit. A huge brawler could scare everyone for 30 seconds, then run out of answers. Frye had more than one answer. He had the wrestling instincts to force contact. He had enough boxing experience to make that contact hurt. He had judo and submission awareness. He had the kind of posture that made him look calm inside a mess. And maybe most important, he had the tournament temperament. He did not fight like he was trying to win a points exchange. He fought like he was trying to clear the bracket. That is why UFC 8 matters so much. February 16, 1996. San Juan, Puerto Rico. UFC 8 was called David vs. Goliath, and that title says everything about what the sport still was. It was part competition, part experiment, part spectacle. Open weight matchups. Wild size gaps. Men with completely different martial arts backgrounds trying to solve each other in real time. Frye's first opponent was Thomas Ramirez, listed at more than 400 pounds. On paper, that was the whole attraction. Could a smaller, trained fighter handle a giant? Would size win? Would technique win? Would everyone watching learn something ugly? The answer came almost instantly. Frye stepped in, landed clean, and Ramirez went down in 8 seconds. 8 seconds. Not 8 minutes of feeling out. Not a slow tactical build. 8 seconds from question to answer. That moment is still one of the most savage introductions in UFC history. But the dangerous part is how Frye responded to it. He did not act surprised. He did not look like a man who had just pulled off a miracle. He looked like the night had started exactly the way it was supposed to start. And the night was nowhere near over. His second UFC 8 fight was against Sam Adkins. This is where the story changes from viral highlight to tournament proof. Anyone can land one punch in the weirdness of early MMA. The test is whether you can come back after the adrenaline dump, face another opponent, and still look like the same problem. Frye did. He overwhelmed Adkins, kept pressure on him, opened damage, and the fight was stopped in 48 seconds. 2 fights. 2 stoppages. Less than a minute of official fight time between them. Now put yourself in Gary Goodridge's position in the final. Goodridge had already become a nightmare figure in the early UFC. He had size, power, and the kind of violent confidence that could freeze a man before the first exchange. Frye could not just rely on aura in that final. He needed a complete performance. He needed wrestling, control, patience, and finishing instinct. That is what he gave. Against Goodridge, Frye showed the piece that made him different from the pure brawlers. He could crash forward, get the fight where he wanted it, and keep scoring until the finish came. He stopped Goodridge at 214 and walked out of UFC 8 as tournament champion. 3 fights. 3 wins. 3 finishes. 1 night. That is not just a cool stat. That is the shape of early UFC greatness. There were no carefully managed prospect builds. No 10-week media packages. No matchup designed to protect your record. You signed up, you walked in, and if you won, another dangerous man was waiting. Frye did not just survive that format. He made it look like it suited him. The reason is his style. Frye's game was not beautiful by modern standards, but it was brutally practical. His stance could look upright. His entries could look rough. His striking defense was not a modern shell. But he had a fighter's sense of where the fight needed to go, and he had the physical confidence to take it there. He used punches to make opponents react. He used wrestling to collapse distance. He used top pressure to steal their breathing room. If they tried to scramble, he made the scramble expensive. If they stayed under him, he kept hitting. If they tried to bully him, they found out he was comfortable in ugly fights. That comfort is the real predator quality. Some fighters are dangerous only when the fight is clean. Frye was dangerous when the fight got dirty, awkward, and exhausting. In early UFC, that was gold. The sport did not reward perfection. It rewarded men who could stay functional inside chaos. After UFC 8, the question became simple: was Don Frye a one-night explosion, or was this the start of something real? UFC 9 gave the answer. 2 months later in Detroit, Frye faced Amaury Baitetti, a respected Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. This was not just another size spectacle. This was a style question. Could Frye deal with a credentialed grappler? Could he keep the fight violent without falling into the exact traps that had already made Jiu-Jitsu famous in the octagon? Frye walked him down. That fight is important because it shows how quickly Frye's identity was forming. He was not trying to win a martial arts debate in a clean classroom way. He was forcing the opponent to deal with pressure, punches, and wrestling before any ideal grappling sequence could settle. Baitetti was dangerous, but Frye made the fight feel like a storm. The official result was a TKO from punches at 9:22. That did a lot for his reputation. Now he was not just the guy who knocked out a massive opponent in 8 seconds. He was the guy who won a tournament, then came back and beat a serious grappler in a long, ugly fight. That is a very different kind of credibility. Then came UFC 10, and this is where the ceiling test arrived. UFC 10 was another tournament night, this time in Birmingham, Alabama. Frye beat Mark Hall by TKO at 10:21. Then he beat Brian Johnston in the semifinal. By this point, he had built the exact reputation every fighter wants and fears. When Don Frye entered a bracket, the bracket became his story until someone proved otherwise. But the final brought Mark Coleman. Coleman was a different kind of problem. He was not just big. He was an elite wrestler with crushing top pressure, and he would become one of the key figures in turning wrestling into a foundation of modern MMA. Frye had wrestling too, but Coleman brought a level of horsepower and positional violence that forced the sport forward. This is why the loss matters. Frye did not lose to a random man who got lucky. He ran into a fighter whose skill set represented the next wave. Coleman took him down, controlled him, and finished with punches at 11:34. It was Frye's first professional MMA loss, and it exposed the truth about the early UFC arms race. The sport was moving fast. Every tournament was a new lesson. Every dominant fighter forced everyone else to upgrade. But even in defeat, Frye's reputation did not collapse. Because toughness is not only what you do when you are winning. It is what people see when the winning stops. Frye kept fighting, kept absorbing, kept trying to find a way out under one of the most punishing wrestlers of the era. That image matters. Early UFC fans respected finishing ability, but they also respected refusal. Frye had both. By the end of that first 1996 run, his place was already obvious. He had entered the UFC as a new face and almost immediately became one of its most memorable attractions. He was not the most polished fighter the sport would ever see. He was not a modern heavyweight with 20 years of MMA systems behind him. He was something more historically important. He was a bridge fighter. Frye connected the wild early spectacle to the more complete athlete the sport was about to demand. He had enough showmanship to make fans care before the bell. He had enough wrestling to make purists pay attention. He had enough striking to punish hesitation. He had enough grit to make the old tapes feel alive decades later. That is why the mustache became iconic instead of cartoonish. The look worked because the fighting backed it up. If a man with that face gets destroyed, he becomes trivia. If he wins 3 fights in one night, beats a black belt, pushes through another tournament, and earns a Hall of Fame career, he becomes mythology. There is also a lesson here about early MMA that gets lost in modern debates. People love asking whether a 1996 fighter could beat a modern UFC contender. Straight time machine answer? Usually no. The sport is too advanced now. Modern fighters have better striking layers, better submission defense, better cage wrestling, better nutrition, better scouting, and better coaching from childhood. But that question is too shallow. The better question is, which early fighters had traits that would still translate if you gave them modern training from the beginning? Don Frye is high on that list. The wrestling base translates. The willingness to exchange translates. The ability to reset after hard contact translates. The instinct to blend punching into grappling translates. The presence translates. And the tournament mindset, that ability to stay ready after one fight and walk into another one, absolutely translates. That is why Frye still feels bigger than his record. He represents a specific version of fighting that the sport needed before it could become clean. He was not there to demonstrate a theory. He was there to prove a man could punch, wrestle, grind, and entertain all at once. And the UFC eventually recognized that. Frye was named to the UFC Hall of Fame Pioneer Wing in 2016. That is the correct category. Pioneer does not mean perfect. It means you were there when the map was unfinished, and your fights helped draw the next line. For Frye, the line was simple: the future belonged to fighters who could do more than one thing and who could keep doing it after the fight turned brutal. That is the real story of the Predator. Not just an 8-second knockout. Not just a mustache. Not just nostalgia for an era where the production looked rough and the rules felt unfinished. The real story is that Don Frye walked into one of the strangest, harshest formats in combat sports and made himself look built for it. At UFC 8, he announced himself. At UFC 9, he proved it was not luck. At UFC 10, he met the next monster and still came out more respected than most winners. That is why fans still talk about him. That is why his name still lands. That is why, when you watch the old footage, the room changes as soon as he appears on screen. Don Frye did not just fight in early UFC. For a stretch in 1996, he looked like early UFC's main character. Drop a comment: was the Predator the most entertaining fighter of the Chaos era, or was he the first real prototype for the modern action heavyweight? If you want more old school deep dives, subscribe and turn on notifications. Stay savage.